Hi, welcome back to another episode of Analyze Scripts. This is our second part of our two-parter covering Quiet on Set, the dark side of kids TV. We hope that you listened to our first part, which we released on Monday. And today we are going to spend more time talking about specifically Drake Bell's story as depicted in this documentary and using it to talk about the warning signs of grooming. So before we get started, Portia, just checking in on how you're doing as we talk about this stuff.
It's so hard to listen to. I mean, I was really overwhelmed, upset watching his interviews. I thought
Yeah.
it was really brave. It's not necessary, for somebody to do that, but it's really brave that he wanted to kind of share with the
Oh,
masses what happened and advocate for change and just give us information to prevent, of course. I think that that's what he had kind of spoken about, given his story, right? Like, I think that there was a couple years ago where he was really kind of getting a lot of backlash for there were some DUIs. There was also, he had gotten in trouble for sending messages to someone who was underage. It had turned out that the person had like portrayed themselves as older. It was just
mhm.
typing stuff. I'm not trying. The person had said that they were older than they were, and they had settled that out of court. Because I know a lot of people. I think he was interviewed by, was it Amanda Hirsch on
Yeah, not skinny but not fat.
yeah. So she had asked him kind of just to speak a little bit about that, because I think there were some mixed reactions to it, and he, provided
Sure.
his information
His
inside, and I
side.
think that was helpful in just hearing why it happened, how things like that happen. But to me, I really applaud him for it. Again, it's not necessary. You don't have to do that if you've been through this, but
Mhm.
it was a
Yeah.
doozy.
It was hard to watch. And again, I kind of had points where I always I'm like a broken record, but I just hope that he has enough support doing this.
Mhm.
That he's still in his own personal therapy or that he feels like, maybe someone's even like on set with him to help debrief or to do some grounding exercises,
Yes.
like things like that. Because I feel like this is almost like trauma therapy, like without the therapy part, like you're just like going through your trauma
Oh,
narrative
yeah.
and talking about your reactions, which can be re traumatizing, duh. And so I just always worry in situations like this. And I felt like we really saw it too, much like we saw in talking about that we talked about in our first part of this, with the female writer. When they
Mhm.
asked her about her experience, you saw her get really uncomfortable. I felt like we saw that with him too, when
Yes.
they were asking him to, say in detail what happened from Brian Peck, and he couldn't. And that
Yeah.
part upset me. I'm not going to lie. He looked super uncomfortable. They already knew what the details were because they had access to the documents. And to ask him to like say it out loud is, I didn't appreciate that.
Yeah. I appreciated his answer. I thought on, yeah, so I think he was also trying to not traumatize the viewer. And then I appreciated that, but then we saw the court documents with some really, really intense words shown, intense sexual acts, and
Really
I was really
devastating.
upset. Yeah. I was really
Just,
upset to
I
see that.
just like, I can't believe humans can do this to each other,
Mhm.
let alone to like vulnerable children. It makes me so
Yeah.
sad. Like just unbelievably sad. I felt so sad for him. I just wanted to hug him. But again, so brave and courageous to come out and talk about this. I can't imagine this has been easy. Duh, it hasn't been easy for him, but I just like what a vulnerable thing to share with the world that now everyone knows. And I don't
Right.
know. I have such mixed feelings.
Yeah. Yeah, so we wanted to talk a little bit about grooming today and how things like this happen, because they do,
Mhm.
and it's never the victim's fault, and just how people can, my word, snake their way in,
Mhm.
and get people into these positions where they're they're really vulnerable. So the first kind of part that we see with grooming is what they call victim selection. So it's when abusers often observe possible victims and select them based on ease of access or perceived vulnerability. See kind of Brian, who's working with all of these children. Point, maybe there were more, but Drake, his parents were divorced. Brian knew that, So we wondered if, Brian had seen some vulnerabilities in Drake, right? Like his
I mean,
parents
all
were
kids are
divorced.
vulnerable, period.
Right, right.
So, like, child
And just
actors are like a specifically, uniquely
yeah,
vulnerable population.
exactly. So maybe he saw that he had some inroads with him. Maybe he was working more with him. Like, I mean, it could be anything. It's certainly not
Mm-hmm.
anything that Drake had done to
Mm-hmm.
deserve being selected. But, it could have been
He,
just more
mhm.
proximity, more access.
And also at some point, his parents get divorced. He was talking about it, and even his dad, who was interviewed, talked about how his mom and dad weren't getting along, that they seemed kind of to be contentious. We don't really know what the details
Right.
are, but that's the kind of thing I feel like predators can sniff out,
Mm-hmm.
to see, like, okay, what's going on. Um, Again, I think, like, there was also some footage of Brian interacting with, like, Leonardo DiCaprio, for example, on the set of Growing Pains, where we sort of saw him, like, caress his elbow in a similar way that we'll get to in a second, that Drake's dad also noticed Brian sort of touching Drake in some inappropriate ways. So you wonder, does he do this with all kids and see, like, who can he keep pushing it with? Who doesn't push back? And then just, is
Right.
that how you select your victim? Sometimes it's as simple as that. You sort
Mm-hmm.
of just lay it out to everywhere and see what sticks. Other times you do sort of sniff out who maybe has a less stable home environment, whose parents aren't around as much. We saw that down the road, he was driving Drake to and from. He was staying at Drake's house. Like, that gives you a lot of time with the child.
Right. Yeah.
So that sort of leads into the next step that's common in grooming, is once you sort of select the victim, these predators will then gain access and isolate the victim. So they will often attempt to physically or emotionally separate them from the people protecting them, and purposefully seek out positions in which they have contact with minors. So we saw that a ton of times displayed here, in right away, like his career choice, he's around kids. Um, Even after he got out of jail for only 16 months, he then got hired again on another kids show,
Right.
right? The Sweet Life. Like, what? Um, and so then there's, like, the whole systemic failure that's allowing these people sort of around children, but you just have to be careful. These people will seek out areas where they're going to interact with victims. It also makes me think about, sometimes predatory people will work at, like, nursing homes or in the medical field or things like that, because again, it leads them to have access to a vulnerable population that's less inclined to fight back or be able to stand up for themselves. So we saw that a ton.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about, like him, like staying at his house and stuff, and like,
Well, he really put a wedge between Drake and his dad, which I think was like
yes,
how he gained access because dad was like sniff weird.
he's called his number.
Yeah. And so I think that, Brian was able to reduce dad's involvement, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
he kind of made Drake be annoyed with dad, and then had mom kind of take over, and then he built a really strong relationship with mom. Oh, I can drive Drake places, I can be helpful. And again, he came in and warmed in person. So I think mom had really trusted Drake. Mom had really trusted Brian at that point. And so then, yeah, like this adult figure is really being helpful right now. Like, great. I don't have to drive him there. That's awesome.
I know, and yet, like, the dad knew. Like, the
Yes.
dad, I mean, maybe he didn't know, but the dad, like, was really listening to the alarm bells going off.
Mm-hmm.
But also was, I think, again, this just displayed, like, the tragedy of grooming so perfectly, that Brian kept wedging his way in. The next sort of step we often see is, they sort of develop this trust with their victim and they start keeping their secrets. So they often treat them as very special. They might buy them gifts, share extra attention with them, be their shoulder to cry on, be their confidant, talking like we didn't see if this happened, but I could imagine him like talking to Drake about how hard it is to have parents who are divorced, and to sort of make him feel like it was safe to tell him, how he was feeling about it, about his frustrations with his parents. And then he's going to use that information to keep driving that
Right.
wedge between Drake and his parents. Um, we saw that he started like coming to his concerts. He wanted to throw him a birthday party, like making him feel really special. All of that appropriately made the dad uncomfortable, right?
Mhm.
Um, but these people are so masterful at what they do. And it's somewhere within, later on in the documentary, Drake even says like he knew exactly what he was doing. Like, please don't blame my mom. Because I think as a viewer, as a mother, that was my natural thing right away, is like, how could you let him be alone with this guy when your ex-husband said, like, there's something up with this guy, don't let it happen. But I think these people are masterful manipulators, right?
Right.
And I could see him just, you know, like, who knows what happened, but like joking about it, like, oh, your ex-husband's nuts. Like, you can trust me. What are you talking about? And maybe he even knew all the way at the beginning that the mom doesn't like driving and that they live far away. And maybe that was what like led to him selecting Drake. We don't know. But
Right.
these people are masterful manipulators.
And he had, in some cases, Drake with Brian's friends, right? So it's like it wasn't just
Hmm.
them two hanging out. It was like, oh, like me and my friends are going to this music festival. Like, why don't you come with us?
But
And
like
so
they
again,
were
like,
like
yeah, that seems
adults.
harmless. I know.
That's the part where I'm like, uh.
I know.
But
I
again,
know.
especially maybe for child actors, where I think it's that kind of thing probably where you're like, well, they're like mature for their age. So they hang out with adults
Yeah.
because they're working around adults. So they get along with adults. It's like that almost gets normalized, but like it's not normal. And
Right.
it's not
Right.
normal for adults in like what, their 20s to want to like hang out with a 13-year-old, 15-year-old,
Hmm.
right? Like
Yeah,
that's
I
not
agree.
normal.
No.
And it
No,
wasn't
it's not.
until Drake's girlfriend's mom like noticed and called it out that I think
Mhm.
things started to change.
Which kudos to her. I mean, I think that sometimes can be an awkward position, like you're not his
Oh
parent.
yeah,
And she really, it seems like, did everything to the best that she could, like called the mom, got permission from her for Drake to see a therapist. Um, and Drake saw the therapist again. So normal, was in it, right? Like was in the trauma
100%.
and didn't want to be, kicked off the show, didn't want things to be awkward, didn't know really what was happening. And I think like that happens. People can be asked point blank in a safe environment, like if something's going on, and they can say no.
Especially if, even if it's a therapist, if it's a doctor, if it's a teacher, if it's whoever, the first time you ask the kid, I would imagine, I don't have any data to back this up, but I would say most of the time they're not going to feel comfortable to tell you. You
Right.
have to develop trust first, and that can take time. So I
Mhm.
wish he would have continued going to therapy for as long as it took to develop that trust. Because again, as a
Yeah.
child in this situation, he's not going to realize that this is abnormal. And it's almost like I did feel like his story, he so eloquently and perfectly gave words to what I think most childhood victims of abuse feel, is like you're dying for someone to ask you, but you're so
Mhm.
terrified to say it. And you're so confused and you're so lost that you don't know what to do. And there's also probably a part of you that loves your abuser. And it's just so complicated. Like it just takes so much trust to be able to like say like, no, this is actually happening.
Right.
So I don't know exactly what happened. It seemed to me like they only went to therapy once. I wish they would have kept
Yeah.
going. I would hope that whatever therapist they saw, when they're told that, we're bringing in this child because this adult on set is calling them over and over and over, really wants to see them. They're saying, no, we feel like something's up. I would hope the therapist would be like, oh, I need to keep seeing this kid,
Mhm.
beyond this one session. Maybe they did, and maybe they couldn't go because their schedule was so busy. We don't know. But that made me sad that,
Yeah.
someone was so close to getting it out and then it still took longer.
Right. What we know, unfortunately, about like how things work is that things don't happen. So if
Right.
he
They
had
don't happen
disclosed
immediately.
to the therapist to go on set the next day and see him, like, that's scary. That's
Yeah,
terrifying.
exactly. Exactly. So those are all the reasons why he might not disclose.
Hmm. Yeah.
So many. Do you want to talk about the next step in grooming?
Sure. So we often see then like a desensitization to touch, and like maybe some discussions around sexual topics. So that would be, like a quick like arm squeeze when someone's walking by, the touch of the elbow, and then kind of seeing how far you can push it. Oh,
Far
how
you can
long can I
go.
leave my arm on, their shoulder? And things, escalate and escalate and escalate. And Drake, had said, just picture the worst things that someone can do
Oh,
to someone. And that's what happened to me. And
so
and that
sad.
was a path, that did not happen on day one. It happened
Right.
over time.
Years in.
And it's how people kind of get used to things, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, like, I'm comfortable with or I'm comfortable with someone touching my shoulder quickly. Oh, I'm comfortable with like a squeeze. Oh, I'm not comfortable with with a leg touch. And then it's like the person knows, oh, okay, like I can't go any farther. But over
Mhm.
time, just
For now.
boundaries keep getting pushed. Exactly. And
Right.
that showing pornography, talking about sexual content. I mean, all of that is kind of just a pathway to sexual acts often.
And we saw
But
that
it's
in
a
the
process.
documentary.
Yes.
Like the dad said
Yep.
at the birthday party, there were all these adult cards and he didn't specify what was in them, but it certainly alluded to sort of materials like this.
Yes.
Um, and so that again, we just see that. It's just like you might show a kid some softcore porn and then it goes further. Who knows? You might be
Right.
talking about sexual topics with them that are way inappropriate for their age. But we totally saw that. And the dad even said, like, one time when he saw Brian trying to help Drake change, and he was like, you don't need to help him. He can get dressed. That's
Yeah.
exactly what we're talking about. Sometimes
Hmm.
people might use like hugging, wrestling, tickling. Those, again, are kinds of things where you could be like, oh, they're just playing around until they're
Yeah.
not. Oh, these things are just like, these are the things that keep me up at night. They're so scary.
I
And
know.
again,
They're
even
really
in
bad.
this documentary, this took, I can't remember exactly the timeline, but I believe it was like years. Like even once his mom became his manager, Brian offered to drive him to and from set. It wasn't like the first day he drove him, something sexual happened. He's just driving him for a long
Right.
time. And then he knows he likes Disneyland. So they're going to go to Disneyland. And then, he has to be at set early. Oh, he can sleep on my couch. Guarantee you, he was able to sleep on the couch without anything inappropriate happening for quite a while before he systematically and slowly eroded the appropriate boundaries until
Mhm.
things started happening. And then it sounds
Right.
like really bad things would happen and they kept happening. And at that point, the poor Drake, like the poor child, like you're just like, what the hell? Like what's going on? What am I supposed to do? This doesn't feel good, but this person I trust is acting like this is normal. What are they supposed to do?
Yeah, and it seemed like that step, even specifically of grooming, happens a lot in this industry with just like, how far can we push the boundaries? Like, oh, we cut back a tiny bit on their education time today and no one
Yeah,
cared. Like, now we can
right,
do it a little bit more. And it's like, this
right.
happened, I think, we saw this all throughout this documentary.
Right. And even like some of the female actors, like on Zoe 101, like the clothes they're wearing, like how far can we
Yep.
push it? Like how little can the bikini top be? Like you just keep pushing it. I totally agree.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
to that effect, kind of the one of the last steps about grooming is again attempts by the abuser to make their behavior seem natural, normal to avoid raising suspicion. So again, this is not only with the victim themselves trying to make it seem normal, but with all the adults around
Mhm.
them. We saw that masterfully done by Brian, disgustingly so. And I do think this is really tricky when you have a teenager, especially if they're closer in age to their abuser, um, because it's just tricky, so you always just have to keep your guard up, when your teen has relationships with adult figures, especially if they involve any secrecy, extra attention, extra praise, wanting to get alone with them, if they have undue control or influence on them in some way, or if they start pushing their boundaries. It usually almost always starts off in more benign types of boundary pushing, and then it progresses. So just,
Mhm.
I would encourage everyone listening, all parents, to just listen to your gut, listen to those inner feelings, and be observant,
Yeah.
because this stuff,
Yeah.
like you said, like happens in this industry. Sadly, it also happens like in schools with
Mhm.
coaches, like in churches, it can happen anywhere. So you just have to be vigilant.
Right. And I think to me, one of the most sad parts was Brian's continued work with kids.
Oh my
And
God.
like they, apparently because children like have parents on set, like that's
That's
the loophole.
disgusting. That's
Um,
disgusting.
I know. I know.
Disgusting. There should be no freaking loopholes. First of all, why wasn't Nickelodeon, this huge freaking corporation, doing background checks on every single effing
Right.
person? Sorry, this makes
Right.
me furious. Background checks up the wazoo, and then you are fired forever. Why did he only get
Right.
16 months? Why is he back? Like, why did they tell all the children with their parents out of the room? I don't like any of this.
Because you can't tell me that he's the only voice coach, right?
Come
Like, you
on.
can't tell me that he's coach in the world that we can't, we have to use him. Like, that's
No.
no, I don't buy
Who
that.
cares? When, first of all, also, what are we coaching about their
Yeah,
voices?
yeah,
Like, they're not speaking a different language, they're not in another
no,
accent, they're not singing. What are we doing? What
mhm,
coaching do you need? What are we
right,
coaching?
yeah.
I
What
just
did
I
you think
don't.
about
Oh.
Drake's discussion of Dan's response to him and how that Dan was the only one in the entirety of Nickelodeon who like commented on it, asked him if he needed anything. Like I think that that was a really interesting
Mhm.
like juxtaposition versus what everyone else was saying about Dan and then what Drake was saying about Dan. I mean, I don't think that like just because somebody may or may not have narcissistic traits doesn't mean that they are pro pedophilia by any means, but
Right.
like
Right.
I just think that that was interesting.
I do think it's interesting, and I don't honestly know what to make of it. I mean, that is his story. He is stuck
Mhm.
by it. I believe him. I trust him. I can't remember, was it in the moment that Dan reached out to him? I think
Yeah, it
it
was like when
was,
he
right?
returned. Mhm.
Yeah, because I guess, like, again, I thought it was interesting that, as soon as all this happened, something happened where Drake just, it all came out. He got mad. He like
Yeah.
yelled, he just like let it all out on the phone with his
Yep.
mom. His mom immediately called the police, as she should. And then the police come. That whole thing, the way he talked about his experience with law enforcement, I
Mhm.
also thought was important for us to talk about, because I think many times the people who are there to help you in situations like this can also unknowingly add to the trauma burden, because
Yeah.
you do have to start talking about it. He did call Brian to get the confession. All that made me really uncomfortable. Like, I understand why, because now that they have the confession, they can really get him. On the other hand, he's still a child. And like, that's a lot to put on him,
Mhm.
like to expect him to like tell these strangers like everything and all the detail. I can't believe he was able to do it.
Right.
And I just think like the law enforcement systems in general could really do with some like trauma education about like how to best support people through this. Um, and then, I thought it was interesting that Drake said that, no one knew at Nickelodeon like who the child was. Somehow Dan knew. That's where I got confused, because he said like the higher ups and stuff at Nickelodeon, like they didn't know who the child was involved in the
I think he
lawsuit, but then
asked him
Dan asked
for
him.
whatever reason. Yeah, and then Drake was like, "Yeah, it was me." After like, a meeting where they had talked about why Brian wasn't returning, um, like
And
with
like
the
I
other
couldn't
child
remember,
guard.
like, was Drake at the meeting with the other child stars, or was he not?
I don't remember.
Because if he wasn't at the meeting, then it makes it really clear who the child was. If he was at the meeting, that would be really hard for him to sit through. There's no good way out of this, right? Like,
Yeah.
um, I don't know. I on the one hand, I guess I could see like maybe that was a moment where Dan was compassionate and checking in on him, or maybe not. Maybe he was feigning compassion to make sure he'd show up at work the next day because he needed him to, be the star of Drake and Josh. Unclear.
Yeah.
Like I don't know. It is
But I think
certainly different from everyone else's perception of Dan. That doesn't mean it's wrong though.
right. Right. And what I was gonna say, like, it sounds like that meant something to Drake, in the moment,
Mhm.
and that's great.
Yeah. You can tell that he has had a lot of therapy,
Yeah.
and I hope it's been good quality therapy. It seems like it because he's able to, like, why isn't he mad at all the adults in Nickelodeon? Like, he has a right to be mad at them for not picking this up, for hiring this guy, for hiring the other pedophiles that were there. Like, but he does talk about it now in a balanced way
Mhm.
where like he could be mad at his parents. He could be really mad at his mom, but he's really talking about it in a balanced way. And I feel like he's done a lot of work and you can see that. Um,
Yeah.
one thing he mentioned about therapy that just like really brought tears to my eyes was when he said, like, when he finally went to rehab or to trauma therapy, like he was finally in a place where people, all they wanted was to see him get better.
Mhm.
They weren't asking anything of him. And I was like, oh,
Yeah, I that and
like
his talking,
all the,
yep, about group work
all the,
and just doing it with
yeah,
the other people who were also had shared experiences and who wanted nothing from him but to see him get better. Yeah, exactly.
exactly. Whereas everyone else, his mom, the girlfriend's mom, Dan, they all still wanted something from him. So I could see how that would feel more transactional,
Mhm.
even under the best of circumstances, than being at, in rehab or with trauma therapy where like they just want you to get better.
Yeah,
And we see like
sad.
he has had a lot of struggles, but this is also so common when children go through trauma.
Yes.
When
Yep.
adults go through trauma, this is why we saw still see huge rates of substance use and disordered eating and other things like that coming out of COVID because like it's really hard to process this
Mhm.
stuff and deal with it. And it's really common to externalize or avoid
Right.
in these ways.
Yeah. And, we just to share, we got some of the information on grooming from RAINN's website. So it's
Mhm.
RAINN.org. They have so much good information on,
Mhm.
sexual assault awareness, resources, definitions. They're just a wonderful organization that I do recommend checking out. We'll link to them in our show notes.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Any other final thoughts, Portia, as we wrap up?
No, I think just like wishing Drake the best in his journey forward and continued healing.
Mhm.
And I hope, I pray that this changes, the whole Quiet on Set documentary changes like child work, Hollywood laws and regulations
I
and
know.
protections. I really hope that that's what comes of this, because everyone was
Mhm.
really brave who spoke.
Yes. And I would say, like, as some final thoughts, again, as a parent, you like just listen to your gut. If things feel off, remove your kid from the situation. Again, I think sadly in situations like this, sometimes it doesn't feel as easy. They might be under contract. You might not be able to pay the financial penalty of breaking your contract. Um, we did see some other child actors in this series feel the pressure of financially providing for their family. All of this is really tough, but just trust your gut. Remove your kids if it doesn't feel right. You don't have to like get any more evidence. Just follow that. And also to be aware that this is really hard for children and teenagers to talk about or to tell you. So you also have to be alert for any changes in their behavior, like especially if they're withdrawing more, if they're getting more angry, they're not
Right.
acting like themselves. If you notice they're really nervous before going to a specific place or being around a specific person, all of those things should be warning bells. You should really, investigate those things and believe your kids when they tell you what's happening.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us for this episode. We know this stuff is hard to talk about, but it's really important. And again, we'll link to the to RAINN in our show notes. Another plug for Allison Stoner and all the work she's doing. Please check us out on Instagram and TikTok at Analyze Scripts Podcast and on YouTube. Let us know what you think of this documentary and what you want to hear us cover next. And we will see you next week with our first part of American Horror Stories Season 1. So another dark show, but dark for a different reason. All right. Bye.